Imagine standing on a vast stretch of fertile land, the sun rising over fields that have been cultivated for generations. This land is more than soil, it is a symbol of freedom, opportunity, and hope. For African Americans at the dawn of the 20th century, owning land represented the hard-won promise of independence after centuries of enslavement. In fact, around 14 million acres were in the hands of black families, a testament to their determination, resilience, and vision for the future. These lands were not just plots of earth, they were homes, farms, businesses, and the foundation of generational wealth that could provide education, security, and a stake in a society that had long denied them both. Yet, as the century progressed, this vision faced relentless challenges. By the 21st century, only about 1.1 million acres remained under black ownership. How did millions of acres, built up through effort, ingenuity, and sacrifice, slip away? The story is not one of simple misfortune, it is a tale of systemic barriers, of laws and practices designed to strip away wealth, and of communities repeatedly targeted by those who sought to maintain power and control. Each acre lost represents a family disrupted, a community fractured, and a dream deferred. In this video, we are going to explore how African Americans, despite their hard work and dedication, were often denied the ability to retain their land. We will uncover the methods used, the historical context, and the long-lasting consequences of this massive loss of property. From acts of intimidation and violence to legal loopholes and predatory practices, the story of black landownership is intertwined with the broader struggle for equity, justice, and recognition in America. But this story is not only about loss, it is also about resilience, courage, and the ongoing fight to reclaim what was taken. By understanding the past, we can better appreciate the efforts of communities and individuals who continue to work toward economic empowerment and equity today. We can see the land not just as a commodity, but as a legacy, a cultural anchor, and a symbol of enduring strength. If you want to learn more about this important part of history, make sure to smash the like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that shines light on the experiences that shaped our world. Stick with us as we dive into this fascinating, sometimes heartbreaking, but always enlightening journey through the history of black land ownership in America. Because by understanding where we came from, we can better understand where we are going and why reclaiming and preserving black wealth matters, now more than ever. As the 20th century unfolded, the promise of land ownership for African Americans, hard won after generations of oppression, faced an insidious and relentless challenge. The fields that had once symbolized freedom, prosperity, and independence increasingly became the target of calculated efforts to strip black families of their wealth and heritage. It was not a matter of simple misfortune or random circumstance. Rather, a sophisticated network of social, legal, and economic mechanisms worked together to systematically dispossess African Americans of the land they had fought to claim. White farmers, landowners, and even local officials were deeply involved in this process, leveraging violence, legal loopholes, and bureaucratic manipulation to seize property with alarming regularity. These efforts were often cloaked in the language of law, yet behind the statutes lay a clear intent to maintain racial hierarchy and suppress black economic progress. The tactics employed were multifaceted and interwoven, blending overt aggression with subtle bureaucratic pressure. Violence was the most immediate and terrifying tool, used not only to intimidate but to enforce compliance with a rigid social order. In towns and counties across the South, armed groups descended upon black communities under the cover of darkness, setting fire to homes, threatening families, and leaving a trail of destruction designed to force people from the land they had labored to cultivate. The infamous events in places like Tulsa, Oklahoma, where Black Wall Street was destroyed in 1921, and Forsyth County, Georgia, in 1912, were not isolated tragedies but part of a broader pattern of intimidation and forced displacement. Entire communities could vanish overnight, with families driven to sell land for a fraction of its true value, fleeing violence with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the memories of what had been lost. Yet violence alone could not always achieve the widespread transfer of wealth that the system demanded. Legal manipulation provided the framework to convert intimidation into permanent dispossession. Laws that appeared neutral on the surface, such as tax partition acts and inheritance statutes, were often applied in ways that disproportionately harmed black landowners. Property taxes were deliberately assessed at levels beyond what a family could reasonably pay, creating the conditions for forfeiture at county auctions. Partition sales allowed individual heirs or co-owners to sell land without the consent of other family members, leaving multi-generational properties vulnerable to acquisition by opportunistic outsiders. Even legal instruments intended to clarify ownership, such as the Torrens system, were weaponized to bypass consent and erase the claims of rightful owners. Over decades, these legal tools became a means to legitimize the seizure of property, while maintaining the veneer of legality, making the process nearly unstoppable once set in motion. Behind the legal frameworks, the human element, the officials, neighbors, and opportunists played a decisive role. County assessors, local sheriffs, and developers often collaborated, tacitly or overtly, to ensure that black families could not navigate the complexities of bureaucracy without losing everything. A single misstep, a delayed tax payment, or even a misunderstanding could trigger a cascade of consequences, culminating in the loss of land that had been in a family for generations. In many cases, white neighbors or so-called friends would exploit trust, submitting falsified documents or failing to pay taxes on behalf of the property owner, then purchasing the land at auction for a mere fraction of its true value. The result was a quiet, systematic expropriation that left families disoriented, impoverished, and often unable to reclaim their legacy. The psychological and social pressure accompanying these losses cannot be understated. Threats of violence and legal harassment created an atmosphere of constant fear, forcing families to make impossible choices. Some chose to sell under duress rather than risk further danger. Others abandoned property entirely, becoming refugees in their own country. Even those who attempted to resist often faced overwhelming opposition. Stories abound of families who returned from the fields to find their homes burned, their crops destroyed, or their livelihoods legally nullified. In such an environment, maintaining ownership required extraordinary courage, resources, and knowledge, qualities that systemic oppression actively undermined. The cumulative effect of these strategies was devastating. Not only were black families deprived of their immediate wealth, but entire generations were denied the opportunity to build economic security through land. The stolen property was rarely redistributed among those who needed it. Instead, it enriched white families, developers, and speculators, widening the racial wealth gap in ways that continue to resonate today. The loss of land translated directly into diminished access to education, diminished capital for entrepreneurship, and reduced ability to leverage property for loans or investment. Over time, this created a structural disadvantage, embedding inequality into the very fabric of society and perpetuating cycles of poverty and disenfranchisement. Yet, within this story of dispossession lies a testament to resilience, despite the constant threat of violence, legal maneuvering, and economic caution. Countless African American families fought to retain their property, asserting their rights in courts, communities, and daily life. They cultivated land, built homes, and maintained cultural and familial legacies in the face of overwhelming adversity. While history records the theft and loss, it also records resistance, courage, and the determination to preserve dignity and identity. By studying these methods and understanding the human stories behind the statistics, we gain insight not only into past injustices, but also into the enduring strength and perseverance of those who endured them. The story of how African Americans were systematically stripped of their land is not simply a historical account, it is a mirror reflecting the ongoing challenges of equity, ownership, and opportunity. It compels us to ask how society might rectify past wrongs and ensure that future generations are not similarly deprived of the tools to build wealth, security, and community. In exploring these dark chapters, we honor the memory of those who fought to claim their rightful place, and we recognize the urgency of confronting the legacies that continue to shape the landscape of American life today. As the sun rose over towns and countryside across the American South, the promise of land ownership for African Americans was overshadowed by a looming and relentless threat: the terror of violence. The early decades of the 20th century were marked by a dark orchestration of fear, designed to maintain social and economic control by targeting those who dared to prosper. Lynchings, mob attacks, and acts of racial cleansing were not sporadic tragedies but deliberate strategies to intimidate black landowners and communities, eroding their ability to retain the property that had been painstakingly built through generations of effort, sweat, and resilience. These violent episodes sent ripples through neighborhoods, transforming once thriving communities into cautionary tales of loss and displacement, leaving families with the stark choice between survival and holding on to their land. One of the most notorious instances of this violence was the destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in 1921. Here, a vibrant, self-sufficient African American community had developed a flourishing economy, with businesses, homes, and schools built by the very hands of its residents. The wealth of the community, far from being a cause for celebration, became a target for resentment and aggression. Over the course of just 2 days, a white, fueled by a combination of racial animus and economic envy, razed entire neighborhoods, leaving dozens dead, hundreds injured, and thousands displaced. Homes and businesses that had represented decades of labor and investment were reduced to ashes, and the survivors were forced into temporary shelters or migration, often unable to reclaim the land that had been their foundation. The physical destruction was matched by psychological terror, a message to African Americans across the country that prosperity could be met with violence, and that the very act of owning land could invite lethal consequences. Similar tragedies unfolded in other locations, each contributing to a broader pattern of terror. In Forsyth County, Georgia, in 1912, black residents were forcibly driven from their homes and communities, victims of coordinated intimidation and violent attacks orchestrated to enforce racial hierarchies. Entire families fled with nothing more than what they could carry, leaving behind property, businesses, and roots that had been established over decades. These events were not anomalies. They were part of a systemic campaign to assert dominance and extract wealth from African Americans. Often sanctioned, ignored, or actively facilitated by local authorities who were complicit in the enforcement of white supremacy. The mechanics of these attacks were as varied as they were cruel. Armed mobs would ride into towns under cover of darkness, firing weapons, burning homes, and threatening lives, ensuring that black families could not maintain their presence or defend their property. Sometimes, the violence was sudden and targeted, singling out particularly successful landowners whose prosperity challenged the established social order. Other times, it was widespread, aimed at entire communities to ensure no black presence remained in a given area. These acts of terror were documented by local press, historians, and civil rights organizations, painting a consistent picture of a society where law and social norms were manipulated to reinforce systemic inequities and discourage African American progress. The impact of these campaigns extended far beyond the immediate victims. Families that survived often had to sell their property at drastically reduced prices or abandon it entirely to escape harm. This created a cycle in which land, once cultivated and passed down through generations, shifted into the hands of those who had orchestrated or capitalized on the violence. The wealth that African Americans had painstakingly built was transferred to others under duress, further widening the racial economic divide. Even as the violence subsided in intensity over the decades, the legacy endured. Property records reflected transfers obtained under extreme coercion. Communities were fragmented, and the ability to accumulate generational wealth was severely curtailed. Individual stories bring this systemic terror into sharp relief. Families like those in Birmingham, Kentucky, experienced repeated attacks from organized groups known as Night Riders, who terrorized black farmers over several years, burning homes, shooting at residents, and forcing the sale of land for paltry sums. Similarly, in Pierce City, Missouri, an organized armed group expelled the entire black population, confiscating homes and farmland, which were subsequently sold at bargain prices to white buyers. Each instance was a calculated effort to remove African Americans from landownership, combining the immediacy of physical danger with the long-term consequences of economic disenfranchisement. Even in cases where black landowners attempted to comply with legal and financial requirements, the looming threat of violence created an environment where mistakes, delays, or misunderstandings could be fatal. Communities were destabilized, family structures strained, and cultural ties to the land disrupted, all serving the broader objective of consolidating wealth and control away from black hands. The psychological toll of living under such constant threat cannot be overstated. Generations grew up with the knowledge that prosperity might invite retaliation, that success could trigger deadly consequences, and that the security of their homes and livelihoods was never guaranteed. Through these acts of terror, the landscape of black landownership was dramatically reshaped. Properties that had been cultivated and cherished for generations were lost, not through lack of effort or mismanagement, but through systemic, targeted violence. The lessons embedded in these histories are profound. They illustrate how fear, aggression, and manipulation were wielded to control populations, limit economic independence, and enforce social hierarchies. They remind us that the loss of land was not simply a matter of economic calculation, but a deeply human story of courage, resilience, and the high stakes of claiming one's place in a society structured against equality. Understanding this chapter of history is crucial not only to acknowledging past injustices, but to recognizing the enduring consequences that shape contemporary economic and social landscapes. The terror inflicted on black landowners left scars that reverberate across generations, shaping access to resources, wealth, and opportunity. By remembering these stories and honoring those who endured, we gain insight into the resilience required to maintain dignity and agency in the face of systematic oppression, and we are reminded of the importance of justice, equity, and vigilance in ensuring that history does not repeat itself. In the Deep South, where the soil was rich and the sun bore down on fields worked for generations, the story of wealth and success for African American farmers often carried with it an unspoken peril. Anthony Crawford, a prosperous landowner in Abbeville County, South Carolina, embodied both the promise and the danger of black prosperity during the early 20th century. His story is not simply one of individual achievement, but a reflection of a broader struggle, in which African Americans who dared to build wealth were met with lethal opposition. Crawford inherited fertile farmland from his father and expanded his holdings through strategic purchases, cultivating a thriving enterprise that provided for his family and positioned him as one of the most prominent black citizens in the county. He was also a community leader, co-founding the Industrial Union of Abbeville County, which aimed to advance the material, moral, and intellectual well-being of African Americans in the region. Despite his accomplishments and status, Crawford's success made him a target in a society that had clear, if unwritten, limits on black advancement. The dangers he faced were both immediate and systemic, a combination of personal risk and the weight of structural oppression. White neighbors, officials, and opportunists were acutely aware that wealth and land ownership among African Americans challenged the social order, undermining the foundations of white supremacy. In Crawford's case, this awareness manifested in violent, premeditated action. A disagreement over the price of cotton seed with a white store owner escalated quickly into a deadly confrontation, drawing in bystanders, officials, and a mob that was already primed to enforce racial boundaries with brutality. Crawford, a man known for his assertiveness and business acumen, initially defended his rights through legal channels, posting bail when briefly arrested. Yet the mechanisms of justice were manipulated or ignored, allowing a crowd of armed white men to pursue him with deadly intent. The assault on Crawford was brutal and unrelenting. After being chased into a cotton mill, he defended himself with a hammer, temporarily fending off his attackers. Yet the mob ultimately overcame him. He was abducted, beaten, and publicly executed in a display designed to terrorize the entire black community. A message to anyone who might aspire to similar economic independence. The coroner's report attempted to obscure the truth, claiming he died at the hands of parties unknown. But the reality was undeniable to those who witnessed it. Crawford's life and property were violently seized because of the threat his prosperity posed to entrenched social hierarchies. His family, 12 sons and 4 daughters, faced immediate repercussions. In the days following the murder, local authorities and community leaders orchestrated the expulsion of the Crawford family from Abbeville, seizing their substantial property and closing black-owned businesses. Generations of accumulated wealth and hard work were abruptly erased, leaving the family dispossessed and scattered. Crawford's story, while extreme, was tragically emblematic of a broader pattern that stretched across the South. Prosperous black farmers, particularly those who achieved visibility and influence, were consistently at risk of violence, legal manipulation, and economic sabotage. Their success threatened a system that relied on maintaining racial hierarchies and limiting opportunities for African Americans to accumulate wealth. In many instances, death or the threat of death was the most immediate instrument used to transfer property from black families to white neighbors or developers, often at minimal cost. Estates and land holdings that had taken decades to build could be seized overnight, either through mob action or through legal structures that enabled forced sales. Partition acts, and other mechanisms designed to bypass consent and ownership rights. The impact of Crawford's murder extended beyond the immediate loss of property. It sent a chilling message to neighboring communities and aspiring black entrepreneurs. Prosperity could invite deadly consequences, and the pursuit of economic independence was fraught with existential risk. Families who survived such attacks were often forced to abandon land, sell under duress, or flee entirely, leaving behind homes, farms, and businesses that had been the result of years of toil. Even when property remained physically intact, the psychological weight of potential violence undermined the ability of African Americans to maintain ownership, invest in their land, or plan for the future. Over time, this systemic threat contributed to the erosion of generational wealth, widening the economic divide and reinforcing the social structures that limited black mobility and opportunity. Crawford's legacy, however, is not merely one of victimhood. His life and the lives of those like him reveal the courage, ambition, and resilience of African Americans in the face of relentless adversity. Despite the risks, families continued to acquire land, cultivate it, and strive for prosperity, demonstrating an extraordinary commitment to community and self-determination. Their struggles underscore the reality that the obstacles were not due to lack of effort or skill but to deliberate, systemic efforts to curb Black advancement. By examining these histories, we gain insight not only into the methods of dispossession, mob violence, murder, legal trickery, and coerced exile, but also into the enduring strength and tenacity of those who resisted, adapted, and survived in a society structured against them. In telling Crawford's story, we also confront the long-term consequences of these actions: the loss of economic independence, the disruption of communities, and the intergenerational impact of wealth extraction. His life serves as both a cautionary tale and a tribute, illustrating the stakes of Black prosperity in a time of systemic oppression and highlighting the resilience required to preserve dignity, identity, and agency. By understanding the full scope of what happened to Crawford and families like his, we better appreciate the enduring importance of land ownership, community, and the ongoing struggle for equity and justice. These stories remind us that history is not simply a record of the past. It is a lens through which we can understand the present and work toward a more just and inclusive future, ensuring that the sacrifices and achievements of those like Anthony Crawford are remembered, honored, and learned from in the fight to secure opportunity and equity for generations to come. Across the southern United States, the early 20th century was a period of both opportunity and peril for African American farmers who had managed to acquire land through inheritance, homesteading, or careful cultivation. Yet the promise of ownership was constantly shadowed by the threat of organized violence, as groups of white vigilantes systematically sought to undermine, intimidate, and ultimately seize property from Black landowners. These vigilantes, often referred to as white caps or night riders, operated with a chilling combination of calculated aggression and social sanction, ensuring that prosperity for African Americans was met with targeted hostility. Unlike random acts of crime, these assaults were deliberate campaigns to enforce racial hierarchies, leveraging fear and intimidation to maintain control over wealth and land that Black families had labored to acquire. The modus operandi of these groups was insidious and multifaceted. They would ride into towns on horseback under the cover of night, carrying weapons and tools of intimidation, their faces masked or hidden to protect identities while simultaneously signaling a collective, organized force. Messages were left for Black landowners, sometimes crudely drawn coffins nailed to doors or cryptic threats delivered under the cloak of darkness, communicating a simple yet terrifying ultimatum: leave your land or face the deadly consequences. This culture of fear was not abstract or symbolic. It was enforced through tangible violence, with homes burned, barns destroyed, crops sabotaged, and physical assaults inflicted on individuals and families who resisted. Those who remained were often subjected to harassment that eroded their ability to farm effectively, attend to business, or sustain their families, making the prospect of leaving appear not only prudent but necessary for survival. Communities were shattered in a matter of hours or days, as Black families, recognizing the imminence of danger, fled en masse to escape harm. The exodus was both physical and economic. Homes were abandoned, farms left fallow, and assets were often sold at drastically reduced prices to escape the threat of violence. In many cases, vigilantes and opportunistic neighbors purchased these properties at bargain rates, turning the coerced displacement of Black families into a direct pathway for wealth transfer. Towns that once had vibrant, self-sustaining Black populations were left depopulated, and the social networks that had nurtured commerce, education, and community cohesion were disrupted or destroyed entirely. These patterns repeated across numerous counties and states, from Mississippi to Missouri, Georgia to Florida, leaving a trail of dispossessed families and concentrated property ownership in the hands of those who had orchestrated or benefited from the violence. Specific incidents highlight the scale and intensity of this campaign. In Birmingham, Kentucky, for example, a tobacco-centered town with a predominantly black population became the target of night riders in the early 1900s. Over a 5-year siege, armed white vigilantes terrorized residents, ultimately killing some and driving many others from their land. Similarly, in Pierre City, Missouri, an armed mob burned homes and forced all black inhabitants to flee, acquiring the vacated properties for minimal sums. These attacks were not isolated but part of a deliberate, patterned approach to remove African Americans from land ownership. The vigilantes operated with varying degrees of tacit or overt support from local authorities, who often turned a blind eye or participated in the enforcement of these racialized land seizures. The psychological impact on black communities was profound, extending beyond the immediate victims to neighbors and distant observers who understood the risks of prosperity. Families that remained in proximity to targeted areas often faced pressure to sell land preemptively, fearing that ownership itself could invite violence. Children grew up with the knowledge that the security of their family's home and future was contingent not on hard work or skill, but on navigating a landscape fraught with peril, where property rights could be nullified by mob action or coercion. The resulting culture of fear contributed to the erosion of generational wealth, as potential black landowners were discouraged from acquiring property or investing in improvements, knowing that any gains could be violently appropriated. Legal and procedural loopholes were frequently exploited to reinforce these extralegal actions. Partition sales, manipulated tax assessments, and coerced agreements allowed vigilantes and white opportunists to formalize control over seized land under the guise of legality, ensuring that once a property was taken, recovery became exceedingly difficult. Families forced to abandon land often lacked the resources, legal knowledge, or social capital to contest these transfers, cementing a cycle in which wealth and property systematically shifted from black hands to white ownership. In this context, vigilant attacks functioned as both a direct and indirect instrument of economic disenfranchisement, combining immediate violence with long-term structural disadvantage. The personal toll of these attacks was immense, with countless families experiencing loss, trauma, and displacement. Entire communities, once cohesive and thriving, were fragmented, with survivors migrating to urban centers or northern states in search of safety, opportunity, and a chance to rebuild their lives. While some were able to start anew, the disruption of land ownership severed deep generational connections to property that had been cultivated for decades, erasing both economic foundations and cultural heritage. Stories of individual families illustrate the scope of the devastation. Property that had been in a family for generations, worked and expanded upon through dedication and expertise, could be lost overnight to the orchestrated violence of a vigilante group, leaving descendants without a tangible legacy of wealth or security. These episodes underscore the broader societal forces that shaped racial disparities in land ownership and wealth accumulation. They reveal a system in which extralegal violence, community complicity, and structural inequities converged to suppress African American advancement. The vigilant attacks were not merely isolated incidents of malice, but part of a coherent strategy to control economic resources, limit social mobility, and reinforce racial hierarchies. Understanding the scope and consequences of these actions provides crucial context for contemporary discussions of racial wealth gaps, property rights, and the enduring impact of historical injustices. By examining the experiences of families who endured forced displacement and coerced land loss, We recognize both the resilience of those who survived and the long-term consequences of targeted dispossession. These narratives offer insight into the intersection of violence, legality, and economic power, illuminating how vigilant action shaped the landscape of American landownership and the lives of countless black families across generations. In the complex web of land dispossession that defined much of the 20th century experience for African American communities, one of the most insidious methods was financial rather than overtly violent. Yet it was no less devastating in its consequences. Overvalued property taxes and predatory tax auctions became tools wielded systematically to strip black landowners of the property they had painstakingly acquired, undermining the very foundation of wealth building and community stability. For families who had inherited land or had managed to buy it following the Civil War and Reconstruction, land represented security, independence, and a tangible legacy to pass to future generations. Yet these fiscal instruments turned ownership into a precarious gamble, subject to manipulation and exploitation by local authorities and opportunistic neighbors. In many southern counties, black-owned land was routinely assessed at rates far above its true market value, a subtle yet effective means of creating financial pressure. Landowners who had cultivated their property with care, invested labor and resources, and relied on modest incomes from farming suddenly faced bills that outstripped their earnings. These inflated assessments often ignored the realities of agricultural cycles, crop failures, or the economic limitations imposed by systemic discrimination in banking, lending, and market access. Families who struggled to meet these artificially imposed tax burdens were labeled delinquent, not because of mismanagement or negligence, but because the system itself was designed to extract resources from those who had little buffer against such pressures. Once declared in arrears, properties were placed on the auction block, often under conditions that ensured minimal return to the original owners. These tax sales were advertised in ways that were intentionally opaque or confusing, further disadvantaging landowners who may have had limited access to legal counsel, literacy challenges due to inequitable education, or simple lack of familiarity with bureaucratic procedures dominated by white officials. In many cases, opportunistic buyers' neighbors, developers, or speculators would attend these auctions with the clear intent of acquiring valuable land at a fraction of its worth. The combination of inflated taxes and strategic auctions created a financial trap. Even when owners intended to retain their land, the system made it nearly impossible to do so without surrendering significant wealth. The story of Evelina Jenkins, a South Carolina Sea Islands resident, illustrates the profound human cost of these predatory practices. Jenkins owned dozens of acres, including an entire island, which in a fair market could have provided not only security for her family but a platform for generational wealth. Yet she was systematically deprived of her property through the actions of a neighbor who collected her tax payments and never submitted them, allowing her land to be declared delinquent. When the property went to auction, the same neighbor purchased it, legally securing ownership through the statutory framework that was meant to protect public revenue, but instead facilitated private gain at the expense of an unsuspecting and vulnerable landowner. Jenkins' land would go on to generate considerable wealth for others. Yet she and her family were left with nothing, her life marked by the bitter irony that her labor and foresight enriched others while leaving her impoverished. Such cases were not anomalies but part of a broader pattern of systemic inequity. Across numerous counties and states, overvalued assessments and manipulated tax processes enabled the extraction of wealth from black communities, often without a single act of overt violence. The cumulative effect of decades of such practices contributed significantly to the racial wealth gap. As land, which is traditionally a primary source of intergenerational wealth, shifted out of black hands and into white ownership, families who once had a tangible asset to leverage for education, investment, or economic mobility found themselves repeatedly disenfranchised, unable to translate labor into lasting security. The psychological toll was equally significant. as the very act of owning land became a source of anxiety, with the threat of financial loss ever present, undermining the sense of stability and control that property is meant to confer. In addition to individual hardship, these predatory practices reshaped communities. Neighborhoods that had once been stable, with multi-generational families working the land and building local economies, faced fragmentation as people were forced to sell or abandon their holdings. The social fabric frayed as schools, churches, and local institutions lost members and financial support, weakening communal networks that had been nurtured over generations. The loss of property also eroded political influence, as land ownership was tied to voting rights, civic engagement, and representation in local governance, further entrenching systemic inequality. The legal and procedural veneer of these transactions added another layer of cruelty. Tax auctions were often framed as routine administrative matters, obscuring the fact that they were mechanisms for dispossession. Once a property changed hands through such a sale, the new owner's title was typically protected against legal challenge, leaving the original owners with little recourse to reclaim what had been theirs. Even when families attempted to navigate the courts or appeal assessments, they faced a system biased against them. With costs, complexity, and procedural hurdles that made resistance virtually impossible. Over time, this cycle of overvaluation, forced auction, and legal entrenchment compounded the economic disadvantages that African American families already faced due to historical discrimination, lack of access to credit, and social marginalization. The consequences of this financialized form of dispossession resonate to this day. Land that could have been the cornerstone of generational wealth, economic stability, and community resilience was lost, leaving a legacy of diminished opportunity and entrenched inequality. The stories of families like Jenkins remind us that violence against African Americans was not only physical but also systemic, manifesting through laws, taxes, and bureaucratic mechanisms designed to extract value from those who had little means to resist. By examining these episodes, we gain a clearer understanding of the interplay between fiscal policy, legal frameworks, and racial inequity, and how the manipulation of seemingly mundane systems, property assessments, and tax procedures can perpetuate profound social and economic injustice. Ultimately, the history of overvalued taxes and predatory auctions serves as a cautionary tale about the power of institutionalized exploitation and the fragility of property rights in a context of systemic bias. It illustrates the persistent challenges African Americans have faced in translating land ownership into enduring wealth and underscores the importance of legal, financial, and social safeguards to prevent similar injustices in the present and future. These narratives compel us to recognize both the resilience of those who fought to maintain their holdings and the structural obstacles that have historically constrained Black economic mobility, offering critical lessons for equity, justice, and the protection of hard-earned assets across generations. In the quiet coastal stretches of South Carolina's Sea Islands, land ownership was once more than a legal status. It was a lifeline, a source of identity, and a symbol of generational resilience for African American families who had managed to hold onto property in the face of centuries of systemic injustice. Among those who possessed this valuable inheritance was Evelina Jenkins, a woman whose story exemplifies both the promise and peril of Black land ownership in the 20th century. Jenkins had inherited and carefully maintained dozens of acres, including an entire island, a property that not only represented years of labor and foresight, but also the potential to provide her descendants with lasting economic stability. In her world, each plot of land, each cultivated field, each dwelling she maintained was imbued with meaning, linking past struggles to a future that she hoped would be secure, prosperous, and self-sustaining. Yet in a cruel twist of fate, the very mechanisms meant to administer fairness and order became instruments of betrayal and dispossession. highlighting how systemic exploitation could operate under the guise of legality. Evelina Jenkins' trust in her community, a natural extension of neighborly ties and shared histories, would ultimately become the source of her undoing. Lacking confidence in navigating complex bureaucracies and motivated by years of disenfranchisement and unequal access to education, Jenkins placed her faith in a white neighbor, someone she believed would act honorably on her behalf by delivering her annual property tax payments. This neighbor, however, chose to exploit her vulnerability, pocketing the payments instead of submitting them, thereby ensuring her land would fall into delinquency. Unbeknownst to Jenkins, the system had been constructed in such a way that non-payment, regardless of intent or circumstance, triggered a cascade of legal consequences culminating in the loss of property. The auction that followed was not a chance event, but a predictable outcome in a framework that prioritized revenue and opportunity for opportunistic buyers over the rights and well-being of the original owner. When Jenkins' property was placed on the county tax auction block, the same neighbor who had withheld her payments moved decisively to acquire it. Through a combination of timing, knowledge of statutory windows, and exploitation of procedural technicalities, he legally secured ownership, transforming an act of personal betrayal into a sanctioned transfer of wealth. What was once the product of Jenkins' inheritance, stewardship, and care now became a commodity generating profit for another, with Jenkins herself completely excluded from the gains. The scale of the loss was staggering. An entire island, previously valued modestly in her hands, would later be sold to developers and investors for sums that could have secured multi-generational wealth for her family. The homes and land she had nurtured, the agricultural fields she had tended, and the heritage embedded in every corner of her property now served as a foundation for prosperity she would never experience. The injustice of Jenkins' story cannot be overstated. It reveals how systemic inequities, once codified into bureaucratic procedures and fiscal regulations, operate with the same destructiveness as overt violence. Whereas lynchings and mob attacks forcibly removed black families from their homes, predatory tax mechanisms accomplished dispossession quietly, often without a single firearm fired, yet with consequences equally permanent and devastating. For families like Jenkins, the impact was both immediate and generational. The sudden loss of property eradicated the financial security that could have been passed down to children and grandchildren, while also severing the cultural and emotional ties that connect families to land over time. In many, the betrayal she experienced at the hands of a trusted neighbor symbolized a broader societal failure, in which legal structures, ostensibly neutral and equitable, were manipulated to reinforce racial hierarchies and concentrate wealth in white hands. Beyond the personal tragedy, Jenkins' experience exemplifies a broader pattern of systemic dispossession in coastal and rural black communities across the American South. Sea island properties, once held by African American families for generations, were increasingly targeted for acquisition by white speculators as tourism and real estate development expanded. The combination of inflated property taxes, bureaucratic complexity, and reliance on intermediaries created a fertile environment for predatory practices. Families often lacked the education, resources, or legal support to navigate these systems, leaving them exceptionally vulnerable to exploitation. The transformation of land from a symbol of heritage and security into a vehicle for outside enrichment underscores the intersection of economic power, racial inequity, and legal authority, demonstrating how policy and procedure can be weaponized to disenfranchise those already marginalized. The economic ramifications of such losses extended far beyond the immediate owners. Communities were affected as well. Schools, churches, and local businesses that depended on the stability and participation of landowning families experienced decline, while social cohesion eroded under the pressures of displacement. Generational wealth, which could have been leveraged for education, entrepreneurship, or political influence, was transferred instead to individuals and entities outside the community. The story of Jenkins serves as a microcosm of these broader dynamics, revealing how one seemingly small act, the withholding of a tax payment, could trigger a chain reaction with long-term consequences, not only impoverishing a single family, contributing to the systemic erosion of black economic power in a region. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of Jenkins' experience is the contrast between the wealth her property ultimately generated for others and the absence of any tangible benefit for herself or her descendants. The island, now adorned with homes and developments worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, stands as a monument to what could have been, a source of enduring financial security, educational opportunity, and cultural continuity that was denied to those who had rightfully earned it. The emotional toll, too, was profound, as the loss signified not only a material deprivation but also the erasure of personal and familial legacy, a reminder that justice can be circumvented by those who manipulate the system with knowledge, privilege, and intention. Evelina Jenkins' story reminds us of the vulnerabilities inherent in a system where property ownership is mediated by complex bureaucratic structures, where trust can be exploited, and where racial inequities amplify the consequences of individual misfortune. Her experience underscores the critical importance of legal safeguards, community support, and equitable governance in protecting property rights, particularly for historically marginalized populations. As we reflect on her life, the narrative offers a powerful lens through which to understand both the resilience of black landowners and the structural challenges they have faced, highlighting the enduring impact of historical injustices on contemporary patterns of wealth, opportunity, and social equity. Ultimately, her story stands as a testament to the need for vigilance, reform, and awareness, ensuring that the lessons of the past inform a more just and equitable approach to land ownership in the future. In the tangled and often treacherous landscape of property ownership for African American families in the 20th century, the very laws meant to clarify and protect ownership sometimes became instruments of dispossession, turning co-ownership arrangements into legal traps. Across the South and other parts of the country, families who inherited land from their parents or grandparents often found themselves holding property jointly, with multiple heirs named on deeds, a reflection of the intergenerational nature of wealth, memory, and care. At first glance, these arrangements symbolized continuity and shared stewardship, a way to preserve family legacy across generations. Yet the reality of co-ownership, when intersected with predatory legal mechanisms, revealed a hidden vulnerability. Any single co-owner could trigger a legal process that might force the sale of the entire property, leaving the remaining heirs powerless and often bereft of the wealth they had expected to inherit. One such legal mechanism, rooted in what were known as partition sales, permitted co-owners to petition the courts to divide property, or to sell it when consensus could not be reached among all parties. While designed ostensibly to resolve disputes and clarify ownership, the system was rife with potential for exploitation. Unscrupulous buyers and developers quickly recognized that targeting co-owned properties, especially those with absentee or less informed black heirs, provided an opportunity to acquire land at a fraction of its true market value. Families often received little or no notice, and even when notified, they frequently lacked the resources, legal expertise, or financial capacity to challenge the sale. A property that had been painstakingly built, nurtured, and maintained over decades could be stripped from a family almost overnight, its future determined not by merit or stewardship, but by procedural technicalities and strategic manipulation. This vulnerability was compounded by the historical context of disenfranchisement, limited access to formal education, and systemic economic inequities. Many African American co-owners inherited land but lacked familiarity with legal processes or the financial means to hire attorneys to defend their interests. Communication between heirs, sometimes scattered across counties or states, was difficult to maintain, and disputes or delays natural in any extended family could be leveraged by opportunistic actors to initiate petition sales. Even when some family members wished to retain the property, others might be coerced, persuaded, or incentivized to sell, often under circumstances that left the family as a whole unable to prevent the transfer. In this way, partition mechanisms became not simply legal tools but vehicles for extraction, converting shared ownership into a liability rather than a protection. A particularly poignant illustration can be found in the story of a family whose ancestral land had been carefully cultivated for generations, producing crops, supporting homes, and sustaining a vibrant local community. The land, originally obtained after the Civil War, had survived decades of social upheaval, discriminatory taxation, and occasional threats of violence. However, as family members aged, moved, or passed away, the number of co-owners expanded, and maintaining consensus became increasingly complex. Developers, having recognized the vulnerabilities inherent in co-ownership, approached the family with offers that seemed fair on the surface, but were carefully designed to exploit gaps in communication and understanding. Legal proceedings, often framed as neutral and equitable, allowed sales to proceed without the consent of all heirs, and once completed, the courts protected the purchaser's title from challenge, leaving the family with no recourse. What had once been a source of security and pride was now lost to outsiders who gained both economic advantage and social leverage from a system skewed against those it claimed to protect. The consequences of such dispossessions were profound, affecting not only the immediate owners but the broader social and economic fabric of Black communities. Land that had served as a foundation for generational wealth, education, and community institutions was suddenly concentrated in the hands of developers or individuals outside the community. Churches, schools, and small businesses, which had relied on the stability and economic participation of landowning families, experienced disruption or decline. Families were forced to relocate, often selling what remained at reduced prices, fragmenting neighborhoods that had long provided mutual support. Cultural continuity and social cohesion. The erosion of property rights also undermined political influence, as landownership was historically tied to voting, civic participation, and representation, further entrenching disparities and limiting the capacity of African American communities to advocate for their own interests. This form of legal dispossession also had lasting psychological and cultural impacts. Families who had survived centuries of systemic racism and violence viewed their land as sacred, a tangible connection to ancestors who had labored under unimaginable conditions. The sudden, often irreversible loss of property through petition sales inflicted not only financial harm, but a profound sense of betrayal and dislocation. The legal system, which might have been expected to offer protection and fairness, instead became an instrument that validated the predatory acquisition of wealth and reinforced existing hierarchies. Children and grandchildren grew up witnessing the disappearance of assets that could have funded education, entrepreneurship, and community development, instilling a lasting awareness of vulnerability and the precarity of gains achieved through labor and diligence. Despite these challenges, the resilience of families navigating such systems should not be overlooked. Many sought to preserve their land through collective negotiation, legal advocacy, or strategic alliances, demonstrating ingenuity and courage in the face of formidable structural obstacles. In some cases, states have begun to adopt reforms aimed at curbing the most predatory abuses of partition and co-ownership laws, including requirements for proper notification, consent of all heirs, and protection of family-held land from opportunistic acquisition. Yet much of the damage has already been done, as countless acres of black-owned land have been permanently transferred, depriving communities of resources that could have fostered economic mobility. Cultural preservation and intergenerational wealth. The history of co-ownership and partition sales underscores the complex interplay between law, power, and economic inequity. It illustrates that even neutral-appearing legal mechanisms can be weaponized to disenfranchise, particularly when intersecting with systemic racial discrimination. By examining these practices, we see how African American families were repeatedly challenged to convert inheritance and stewardship into security, often in the face of structural forces designed to undermine them. The stories of dispossession serve as both a warning and a call to action, reminding us that equitable legal safeguards, community advocacy, and vigilant protection of property rights are essential to prevent repetition of historical injustices, ensuring that land remains a source of legacy, stability, and empowerment rather than exploitation and loss. In the rural landscapes of the American South, where the legacy of emancipation intersected with systemic inequities, many African American families held onto land for generations, not merely as property but as a tangible link to ancestry, identity, and economic security. These holdings, passed down from parents to children without interruption, often lacked formal legal titles, a vulnerability rooted in historical circumstances including limited access to legal resources. Educational disenfranchisement and systemic barriers to the recording of property ownership. To families who had endured the trials of slavery and post-Reconstruction oppression, these lands were symbols of resilience, spaces where they cultivated crops, built homes, and nurtured communities. Yet, in a society where legal recognition was a prerequisite for protection, the absence of formal documentation rendered these multi-generational estates perilously exposed to manipulation. Forced sales and predatory acquisition, often by outsiders who exploited every procedural loophole available to claim wealth that was never rightfully theirs. Consider the experience of a family whose ancestors had worked tirelessly to claim a modest plot of farmland during Reconstruction, transforming it into a thriving homestead over decades. As the property passed from one generation to the next, each heir contributed labor, care, and vision. Yet none had the legal expertise or resources to formalize the title in a manner that would withstand challenges from opportunistic buyers or unscrupulous developers. The family's trust in community relationships and the assumption that shared familial ownership would naturally confer security became their undoing. Without clear documentation, the property was susceptible to petition actions, tax claims, or direct acquisition, legal avenues that could be leveraged by individuals well versed in the bureaucratic intricacies of property law. What had been nurtured for decades, representing the sweat, skill, and dedication of multiple generations, could be removed from the family through a combination of legal ambiguity and predatory intent. Predatory acquisition often followed predictable patterns. Developers or investors, aware of the fragmented ownership structure and the absence of formalized titles, would identify properties where co-owners were distant, uninformed, or unaware of legal proceedings. Notices could be missed, deadlines overlooked, and opportunities to contest sales lost, effectively clearing the way for the sale of land at far below its market value. In many cases, the proceeds of these transactions, which should have supported families and community institutions, were entirely diverted to those exploiting the legal and procedural gaps. The losses were both immediate and intergenerational. Families lost home, farmland, and community spaces, while future generations were denied the economic foundation that would have enabled education, entrepreneurship, and social mobility. The psychological and cultural ramifications of such losses were profound. Land that had been held as a sacred inheritance, imbued with stories of survival, ingenuity, and endurance, was suddenly stripped away, often without any tangible recourse. Elders who had labored to cultivate soil and community watched the fruits of their lifelong efforts disappear into the hands of outsiders, leaving younger family members with not only financial loss but a sense of dislocation from the very heritage that had sustained their identity. The invisibility of legal rights in such contexts rendered families vulnerable to exploitation, while the perpetrators of these acquisitions often operated within the bounds of law, underscoring the chilling reality that legality did not equate to justice. The vulnerability of multi-generational property without formal titles also intersected with racialized economic structures. African American families, often excluded from broader systems of banking, legal counsel, and civic participation, had fewer mechanisms to contest fraudulent or coercive practices. The societal assumption that formal title equaled legitimacy disproportionately disadvantaged black landowners, allowing wealth to be redirected away from those historically marginalized and toward individuals or entities who could navigate and manipulate the system to their advantage. Consequently, the very structures designed to record and protect property became instruments of disenfranchisement, reinforcing historical inequities and perpetuating cycles of disadvantage. Even within families, the absence of formal documentation could create internal tensions. With multiple heirs, decisions about the use, maintenance, or sale of property became complicated by disagreements or misunderstandings, and these internal divisions were often exploited by outsiders seeking to initiate partition sales or secure ownership through legal means. A single absent or uninformed co-owner could inadvertently trigger proceedings that resulted in the sale of property without the consent of the entire family, illustrating how procedural technicalities could be weaponized against those lacking both resources and legal literacy. The combination of internal family complexity, legal vulnerability, and external predation formed a potent threat to the continuity of multi-generational land ownership. Despite these challenges, families demonstrated remarkable resilience, employing strategies such as cooperative management, informal agreements, and community advocacy to protect their holdings whenever possible. Yet, the success of these strategies was limited by systemic inequities that favored those with education, access to capital, and knowledge of bureaucratic procedures. The long-term effect of such legal vulnerabilities has been the cumulative erosion of black-owned land, with millions of acres lost to predatory sales and acquisitions over decades, stripping communities of both wealth and cultural continuity. The story of multi-generational land without formal titles is a testament to the intersection of legal structures, economic power, and racial inequality. It reveals how property law, while neutral in theory, can operate in ways that amplify historical injustices when exploited by those with resources, knowledge, and intent to take advantage of vulnerable populations. These patterns of dispossession highlight the importance of legal protections, education, and equitable access to resources in safeguarding inheritance and sustaining community stability. Families who have navigated these challenges exemplify resilience and ingenuity, yet their experiences serve as a sobering reminder that the loss of formerly unrecognized land is not merely a matter of property but a profound social, cultural, and economic injustice that reverberates across generations. Understanding this dynamic illuminates why, despite centuries of labor and persistence, African American land ownership remains disproportionately concentrated and why the gap in generational wealth persists. The vulnerabilities of informal title structures, exploited through predatory legal mechanisms and reinforced by systemic inequities, continue to shape the landscape of opportunity and dispossession. The narrative of these families, their struggles, and the mechanisms by which they were deprived of their rightful holdings underscores the enduring necessity for vigilance, reform, and proactive measures to protect property rights, ensuring that land serves as a foundation for legacy and empowerment rather than a conduit for exploitation and loss. The story of land theft in America is not merely a historical footnote. It is a thread that weaves directly into the present-day disparities that continue to shape economic opportunity and social mobility for African Americans. The loss of property across generations had profound and lasting consequences, undermining the capacity of families to build wealth, invest in education, and create community institutions that could provide long-term stability, as we have traced the forced sales, predatory legal maneuvers, and violent expulsions of black landowners. A broader pattern emerges. Land was not just property, but a fundamental instrument of economic empowerment, and its theft systematically prevented African Americans from accumulating the wealth necessary to compete on equal footing with white counterparts. By seizing control of land and property, communities that had managed to establish footholds in the post-Civil War era were stripped of the resources that could have underpinned generational growth, turning opportunities into losses that reverberated for decades. Homeownership has long been recognized as a cornerstone of wealth accumulation, a mechanism through which families secure stability, access credit, and pass assets from one generation to the next. For African Americans, however, the historical theft of land created an enduring obstacle to these benefits. Families who might have used farmland or urban property as collateral for business ventures, education, or home improvements found themselves deprived not only of their current assets, but of the potential for compounding wealth over time. The persistent effects of these losses are visible in statistics. Today, black homeownership rates lag behind those of white households, and the median wealth of black families remains far below that of white families, despite equivalent levels of effort, education, and employment. The cumulative effect of land dispossession, coupled with other structural barriers such as discriminatory lending practices, redlining, and unequal access to capital, reinforced a cycle in which wealth creation was continuously hindered, leaving a legacy of inequality that extends into the present. The stories we have recounted, the violent expulsions, the predatory tax sales, the exploitation of co-ownership laws, and the dispossession of multi-generational property demonstrate that the racial wealth gap is not simply a result of individual misfortune or lack of effort. Rather, it reflects a deliberate pattern of systemic exclusion, in which legal, economic, and social structures were manipulated to deprive African Americans of the means to prosper. Land theft functioned as both a material and symbolic tool. It deprived families of tangible assets while sending a clear message about who could wield power, control resources, and claim legitimacy in American society. The suppression of black land ownership reinforced social hierarchies, constrained political influence, and ensured that African Americans were consistently forced to play catch-up in accumulating generational wealth. Consider, for example, a black farming family whose ancestors had acquired fertile acreage after the Civil War. For decades, the family cultivated the land, paid taxes, and contributed to local economies, yet the absence of formal titles, combined with exploitative partition laws and unscrupulous neighbors, left the property vulnerable. When portions of the land were sold under duress or acquired through loopholes, the family not only lost income and assets but also the opportunity to leverage property for future investment. The ripple effects touched education, business development, and the stability of local communities. Children who might have inherited farms or plots capable of supporting higher education found themselves starting from zero, while neighbors and outsiders accrued wealth that had originally been earned by the labor and vision of the displaced families. In this way, the theft of land perpetuated cycles of disadvantage, making it significantly more difficult for African American families to achieve parity with white households who enjoyed uninterrupted opportunities to build equity and transfer wealth. The broader economic implications are staggering. Estimates of stolen land value in individual states like Mississippi run into billions of dollars. a figure that represents only a fraction of the national scale. Each acre taken, each forced sale executed, each legal loophole exploited contributed to a loss of generational wealth that could have funded businesses, homes, and educational pursuits. Today, the disparity in ownership rates is a direct reflection of this historical theft. While approximately 70% of white Americans own homes, black homeownership hovers closer to 43%, a stark reminder that historical dispossession has a lasting imprint. Furthermore, without the equity and financial stability afforded by property ownership, African American families are less able to withstand economic shocks, invest in new ventures, or access intergenerational mobility, perpetuating the wealth gap across decades. The consequences of land theft extend beyond mere numbers. They shape the lived experience of communities, influencing where families live, the quality of schooling available to children, and the ability to participate fully in civic and economic life. Neighborhoods once thriving under the stewardship of black landowners were often destabilized, as property changed hands and community cohesion was disrupted. Churches, schools, and local businesses that had depended on the stability and investment of landowning families suffered, eroding social infrastructure and weakening the communal bonds that contribute to resilience and long-term prosperity. The theft of land was thus both an economic and social assault, a multifaceted strategy that limited opportunity, stifled growth, and reinforced patterns of marginalization. In reflecting on these histories, it becomes clear that the racial wealth gap is not a simple artifact of contemporary disparities, but the product of a century-long pattern of exclusion, theft, and systemic inequality. Understanding the mechanisms through which African American families were dispossessed, violence, predatory legal frameworks, co-tax sales, and multi-generational vulnerabilities provides context for the ongoing challenges faced by black communities today. It emphasizes that homeownership is more than a personal milestone. It is a foundational element of economic empowerment and a vehicle for generational security. Addressing the disparities that persist requires acknowledgement of historical injustices and a commitment to structural remedies that restore opportunity, protect property rights, and enable equitable access to wealth-building mechanisms. The legacy of stolen land underscores a critical truth. Wealth does not arise solely from effort, talent, or aspiration, but is inextricably linked to access, opportunity, and protection under the law. For African Americans, the theft of land systematically denied these advantages, creating a structural barrier that has endured for generations. As we consider the stories of families who lost farms, homes, and community property, we see not just the economic impact but the human cost, the dreams deferred, the potential unrealized, and the communities altered forever. It is within this context that the persistent gap in home ownership and wealth can be fully understood, revealing both the depth of historical injustice and the enduring need for vigilance, reform, and a commitment to equity in property ownership and economic opportunity. Throughout the tangled history of land ownership in the United States, the role of officials, those entrusted with upholding laws, regulating property, and safeguarding the rights of citizens cannot be overstated, as their actions, or in many cases inactions, profoundly shape the trajectory of African American communities and the enduring racial wealth gap. Across the South and border states, patterns of neglect, complicity, and deliberate facilitation allowed the systematic dispossession of black landowners to flourish, converting legal mechanisms meant to ensure fairness into tools of exploitation, and embedding inequality so deeply that its consequences reverberate to this day. The story of how officials reinforced these injustices is not a tale of isolated incidents but a persistent and structural pattern, where governance, law enforcement, and bureaucratic oversight intersected with racial prejudice and economic opportunism to strip African American families of their land, livelihoods, and, ultimately, their ability to build generational wealth. In the early decades of the 20th century, African American farmers and property owners found themselves subject to an intricate web of local and state regulations designed ostensibly to manage land, taxes, and inheritance. Yet the enforcement of these laws was neither impartial nor protective. Instead, officials often exploited ambiguities or simply ignored violations, creating an environment in which white developers, neighbors, and opportunists could acquire land with impunity. Tax collectors, registrars, and clerks, individuals responsible for maintaining fair property records and ensuring lawful transactions, routinely overvalued black-owned land, misapplied payments, or failed to provide timely notice of tax delinquencies, resulting in auctions where properties were sold far below market value. These acts were not merely administrative errors but strategic enablers of land theft, transforming the machinery of governance into a conduit for wealth extraction, while systematically disadvantaging African Americans who lacked both legal knowledge and political leverage. Consider the case of Evelina Jenkins, a black landowner on the Sea Islands, whose decades of property stewardship were undone not by violent assault or a breach of trust from distant buyers, but by the calculated inattention of local officials. Entrusting her tax payments to a neighbor who promised to deliver them to the county, Jenkins relied on the fairness and oversight expected from governmental institutions, only to discover that her land had been declared delinquent, sold at auction, and transferred to a developer who reaped substantial profits. Here, the absence of intervention by officials, no inquiries into missed payments, no recourse offered, no protective enforcement of her rights underscored a systemic disregard for African American property claims. This episode, far from anomalous, reflected broader patterns in which bureaucratic structures were manipulated, mismanaged, or passively complicit, with devastating consequences for black families whose labor and legacy had made the land valuable. Beyond administrative failures, officials frequently played a more active role in facilitating dispossession. Partition laws, Torrens registration procedures, and heir property statutes could all be applied in ways that appeared lawful but were in practice skewed against black co-owners and multi-generational families. County clerks and judges, often elected or appointed within the same socio-political networks that benefited from land transfer, presided over sales with minimal oversight or inquiry into the consent of all owners, effectively sanctioning expropriation under the guise of legality. In these cases, the law itself became a weapon. Mechanisms designed to clarify ownership or resolve disputes instead provided cover for opportunistic acquisition, while officials ensured that challenges were costly, slow, and unlikely to succeed, thereby reinforcing the displacement of black landholders. Law enforcement officers, too, often contributed to this pattern, whether through active participation in intimidation campaigns, turning a blind eye to threats and violence, or failing to intervene in the face of mob attacks on African American communities. From the organized night raids of white caps and night riders to the systemic neglect during tax and partition disputes, officers either colluded with perpetrators or neglected the protective duties expected of their roles, signaling that the rights of black landowners were subordinate to the interests of white neighbors and developers. The consequences were not only financial but deeply psychological, as families lived under constant threat of dispossession, their connections to land and community repeatedly undermined by those sworn to uphold justice. Even when laws existed to protect property owners, officials' selective enforcement created a dual standard, ensuring that protections were effectively inaccessible to black families while simultaneously safeguarding the interests of white claimants. County boards, tax offices, and courts frequently failed to communicate procedural requirements, applied deadlines unevenly, and tolerated fraudulent claims or coercion. The cumulative effect was a system in which legal avenues that should have empowered property owners instead became instruments of exclusion and disenfranchisement. turning generations of labor, stewardship, and investment into opportunities for others to acquire wealth without equitable exchange. The complicity of officials, whether active or passive, magnified the scale of dispossession and embedded racial inequity within the governance structures themselves. Historical narratives reveal that these patterns were neither coincidental nor sporadic. In communities across Mississippi, South Carolina, Georgia, and beyond, the systematic undervaluation of black land, the approval of tax sales without proper notice, and the facilitation of partition proceedings all contributed to the erosion of African American land holding. Even families who meticulously maintained records, paid taxes, and attempted to engage with bureaucratic processes found themselves powerless against the institutional machinery biased against them. The alignment of official negligence and predatory legal practices ensured that black landowners' efforts were continually undermined, amplifying wealth disparities and reinforcing the socio-economic hierarchy that favored white families over their historically marginalized neighbors. The legacy of these practices persists today. Current disparities in homeownership and wealth between black and white Americans can be traced directly to the patterns of official complicity in past land theft. Understanding the role of governance in these injustices underscores that historical inequities were not solely the result of individual actions or market forces, but were actively reinforced by legal and administrative systems designed, tolerated, or manipulated to disadvantage African Americans. It also illuminates the importance of vigilance, reform, and policy intervention to ensure that property rights are protected equitably, that access to legal recourse is not obstructed by systemic bias, and that the enduring impact of past dispossession can be addressed in ways that foster justice, opportunity, and generational wealth building. Ultimately, the narrative of officials facilitating or enforcing policies enabling land theft is a story of structural betrayal and systemic inequity, where institutions intended to uphold fairness instead perpetuated cycles of dispossession, poverty, and exclusion. It is a reminder that the laws themselves, when applied without impartiality or ethical oversight, can become mechanisms of oppression, shaping the economic landscape and social reality for generations, and leaving a legacy that continues to influence access to wealth, stability, and opportunity in communities across the nation. As we reach the conclusion of this story, it becomes clear that the theft of black-owned land was not a series of isolated incidents, but rather a systematic and coordinated effort that combined legal manipulation, social intimidation, and outright violence to strip African Americans of their property, resources, and opportunity to build generational wealth. From the post-Civil War era to the modern day, black families were repeatedly undermined, whether through lynchings that terrorized landowners into fleeing their homes, legal loopholes that allowed co-owners to sell family property without consent, overvalued taxes and predatory auctions, or negligent and complicit officials who failed to enforce protections. Each mechanism, while distinct in its application, converged toward the same outcome: a persistent and widening racial wealth gap that continues to shape the economic landscape of the United States today. The consequences of this long history are evident in contemporary statistics. Black homeownership remains significantly lower than that of white Americans, and the ability to pass down property and wealth across generations, a cornerstone of economic stability, is far more limited in black communities than it is in white communities. This disparity is not the result of lack of effort, ambition, or stewardship. Rather, it reflects the cumulative impact of centuries of dispossession and systemic bias that denied African Americans the ability to capitalize on land ownership in the same way their white counterparts could. Generations of black families who worked the land, paid taxes, and built thriving communities were frequently forced to abandon their holdings under duress, leaving behind legacies of lost opportunity that cannot simply be recovered. Yet within this painful history, there are important lessons to be drawn. The resilience and perseverance of African American landowners. Despite threats, violence, and institutional neglect, demonstrate the enduring human drive to secure a future for one's family and community. Figures such as Anthony Crawford, Evelina Jenkins, and countless unnamed families embody both the tragedy of systemic injustice and the courage required to confront it. Even when the odds were stacked overwhelmingly against them, their stories remind us that wealth, while material in nature, is inseparable from the social and political structures that surround it, and that fairness and equity must be actively maintained if future generations are to thrive. Reflecting on this history also emphasizes the importance of accountability and reform. When officials and institutions fail to protect property rights or actively facilitate their violation, the effects ripple outward, undermining not only individual families but the economic potential of entire communities. It underscores the need for vigilance, transparency, and legal safeguards that can prevent exploitation, ensure equitable access to resources, and empower marginalized populations to secure and retain wealth. Addressing these historical wrongs is not merely a matter of financial restitution. It is about correcting the structural inequities that continue to influence the social and economic landscape today. The story of black land theft is also a call to acknowledge and confront the broader patterns of inequality that persist in society, recognizing the intertwined roles of law, social pressure, and economic power in perpetuating injustice allows us to understand how wealth gaps are maintained and why historical inequities have long-term impacts. This understanding is crucial not only for historians and policymakers, but for anyone interested in justice, equity, and the creation of a society where all individuals have the opportunity to prosper. It invites reflection on how current policies, economic structures, and social attitudes can either perpetuate or alleviate the consequences of past injustices. As we conclude this examination of black land theft and its enduring impact, it is important to remember that history is not only a record of what has happened, but also a guide to how we might act in the present. By studying these injustices, we are better equipped to recognize unfair practices, advocate for reform, and ensure that the rights of property, opportunity, and wealth are extended equitably to all communities. The legacy of these events challenges us to imagine and work toward a society where the systematic dispossession of one group is no longer tolerated, where history's lessons inform current policies, and where economic opportunity can be genuinely accessible across racial lines. Thank you so much for watching and taking the time to engage with this important part of history. Your attention matters, and your awareness is a step toward ensuring that such injustices are remembered, learned from, and addressed in meaningful ways. If you found this video informative and compelling, please support the channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing, so we can continue bringing you stories that uncover hidden histories and shed light on the forces that shape our world. Together, we can honor the resilience of those who came before us and contribute to a more just and equitable future.